Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Relax with EEG Facts. Today, we're exploring what I learned in Chapter 10 of Wyllie's treatment of epilepsy, titled The Classification of Seizures and Epilepsies. We'll keep it simple, practical, and focused on what actually helps at the bedside. Let's begin. Section 2, Epilepsy, what the definition really means. Epilepsy isn't just having seizures, it's a tendency to have unprovoked seizures over time. Historically, the operational definition in 1993 required 2 or more unprovoked seizures separated by more than 24 hours and didn't count acute symptomatic events like alcohol withdrawal, febrile seizures, concussion, or a single episode of status epilepticus. Take a look at Table 10.1 on your screen. It shows how the ILAE in 2005 and 2014 tightened things up. 1. You still meet criteria after 2 unprovoked seizures greater than 24 hours apart. 2. You can also meet criteria after 1 unprovoked seizure if your chance of another is high, about greater than or equal to 60%, which mirrors the risk of a third seizure after 2. 3. A person with a recognized epilepsy syndrome counts as having epilepsy even after a single unprovoked event because saying syndrome without epilepsy doesn't make clinical sense. A key shift is that epilepsy doesn't have to be forever. It's considered resolved if someone is 10 years seizure-free with the last 5 years off medication, or if they've aged out of an age-limited syndrome. 10 years is conservative, 5 years predicts remission for some groups, but overall, 10 years better predicts long-term freedom from seizures. Resolved means the risk is low, not zero. That's why, and this is important, we don't use the word cure. Since 2014, clinicians have increasingly used this definition. Studies show that when patients qualify based on a single seizure plus high risk, most declare themselves with recurrence relatively soon. Importantly, deciding to treat is separate from defining epilepsy, but the newer definition naturally supports earlier treatment in some first seizure cases when risk is clearly elevated. There was debate about calling epilepsy a disease instead of a disorder. The ILAE favored disease to reflect seriousness and to improve public understanding and research priority. Some worry it could add stigma, but the intent was clarity and parity with other major conditions. Section 3. Seizure Classification. 3.1. The history of seizure classification. Humans have described seizures for millennia. The modern shared language took shape in the late 1960s to the 1980s and led to the 1981 ILAE seizure classification. Think simple partial, complex partial, secondarily generalized. By 1989, the epilepsies were grouped using 2 big lenses, focal versus generalized and cause. As imaging, EEG, and genetics advance, the terminology needed an update, setting the stage for the 2010 framework and eventually the 2017 overhaul. 3.2. Choosing an approach, why 2017 looks the way it does. In a perfect world, we'd classify by mechanism, by brain networks. We're not quite there yet for individual patients. A purely symptom-based system is easy to use but blurs important differences. For example, automatisms could be focal impaired awareness. So the 2017 ILAE system stays clinical first, EEG informed where available, and usable in low-resource settings. It's designed for children and adults with separate schemes for neonates and status. EEG-only patterns don't create categories by themselves. This is a clinical classification. Section 4, the basic seizure classification for primary care. Now glance at figure 10.1 on your screen. The basic model sorts seizures by onset. 1. Focal onset starts in one hemisphere. We describe awareness, aware versus impaired, as a practical stand-in for consciousness. 2. Generalized onset starts in both hemispheres at once. We don't rate awareness here because it's usually impaired. 3. Unknown onset. Focal seizures can be motor or non-motor at onset. If a focal seizure spreads to both hemispheres and becomes tonic-clonic, we now say focal to bilateral tonic-clonic, retiring secondarily generalized to keep generalized reserved for truly generalized onset. Name the seizure by the first clear sign or symptom, since that best reflects the starting network. Generalized motor seizures highlight tonic-clonic. Generalized non-motor seizures are absence. The old grand mal or petit mal labels persist in casual speech, but the modern terms are preferred. Section 5, the expanded seizure classification for specialists. See figure 10.2 on your screen. Same skeleton as the basic version, but with finer detail. Focal onset. 1. Rule of first, classify by the first symptom/sign. 2. Impaired awareness at any point fits with the notion that it's an impaired awareness focal seizure. 3. Behavior arrest gets its own label only when it's the dominant feature for the entire event. 4. Motor types include automatisms, lip smacking, picking, wandering, atonic, clonic, myoclonic, tonic, and hyperkinetic, vigorous thrashing or pedaling. 5. Non-motor types include autonomic, flushing, piloerection, GI upset, tachycardia. Cognitive, aphasia, apraxia, agnosia, or positive hallucinations, not just global confusion. Emotional, fear, galactic, dacrystic, intense joy and/or anxiety. Sensory and behavior arrest when predominant. Generalized onset. 1. Familiar categories remain, plus additions. A. Myoclonic tonic-clonic, classic in juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. B. Myoclonic atonic, seen in Lennox-Gastaut, Dravet, Douze. C. Epileptic spasms, infantile when less than 1 year. D. Absence types, typical, atypical, myoclonic absence, and eyelid myoclonia, often photosensitive, think Javance. Unknown onset. 1. Use when onset can't be determined. Common entries are tonic-clonic and epileptic spasms until more data clarify focal versus generalized. Section 6, practical tips. Use the short form when it's obvious. Focal sensory seizure instead of the whole string. Start with clinical observation, then add EEG, imaging, genetics, immune markers, or family videos as available. Each can push an ambiguous case into the right bucket. Remember, many focal impaired awareness seizures don't look lateralized clinically, but the EEG often is. Section 7, epilepsy classification. A seizure is an event. Epilepsy is the disease that predisposes to unprovoked seizures. The ILAE task force, led by Ingrid Scheffer, built a structure that starts with the seizure type and expands outward. Section 8, levels of epilepsy classification, how it all fits. Now, check figure 10.3 on your screen. Think of 3 stacked levels. 1. Seizure types, focal, generalized, unknown. 2. Epilepsy types, focal, generalized, combined generalized, and focal, unknown. 3. Epilepsy syndromes, when a named syndrome fits. Running alongside all 3, etiology, structural, genetic, infectious, metabolic, immune, unknown, and comorbidities. This scaffold emerged from 2010 discussions and culminated in the widely adopted 2017 ILAE classification, Section 9, Etiology of Epilepsy. When we classify epilepsy, cause matters because it shapes treatment and prognosis. We group causes into 6 buckets: structural, genetic, infectious, metabolic, immune, and unknown, and a single patient can sit in more than one. A structural example is mesial temporal sclerosis, the classic adult driver of focal seizures. Many conditions once called idiopathic are now recognized as genetic, whether through family history or modern testing, though lots of pathogenic variants arise de novo, so family history can be silent. Worldwide, infections are a major contributor. Think parasites, viruses, bacteria. Metabolic problems can cause acute symptomatic seizures that aren't epilepsy if the disturbance is temporary, but persistent metabolic diseases like pyridoxine dependency or storage disorders do qualify as etiologies, and increasingly, we recognize immune causes antibodies targeting neurons, sometimes after encephalitis, sometimes spontaneously. Section 10, comorbidities, the part patients feel every day. Epilepsy isn't only about seizures. The 2014 definition explicitly includes the neurobiologic, cognitive, psychological, and social consequences. In study after study, things like memory problems, depression, anxiety, and stigma can impact quality of life more than seizure counts. That's why comorbidities are now baked into modern classification, because they belong in the clinical picture from day one. Section 11, syndromes, pulling the pieces together. Once we know the seizure type and epilepsy type, we ask, does this fit a named syndrome? A syndrome ties together the clinical story, EEG pattern, imaging, labs or genetics, treatment implications, and prognosis. New syndromes keep emerging and old ones keep refining, so there isn't a single official ILAE master list. Take a look at Table 10.3 on your screen. You'll see many of the commonly referenced syndromes spanning infantile, onset encephalopathies, genetic channelopathies, epilepsies linked to structural lesions like hypothalamic hamartoma, and progressive myoclonic epilepsies. Many are age-dependent, and some conditions, like Down syndrome, aren't epilepsy syndromes per se, but carry a higher epilepsy prevalence. Section 12, how the new classifications are landing. Early feedback has been largely positive. Clinics that recoded their patients with the 2017 ILAE approach found fewer unclassified cases and cleaner descriptions. For example, focal to bilateral tonic-clonic, replacing secondarily generalized. Critiques do exist. Some worry the system mixes semiology with localization, doesn't capture seizure evolution perfectly, or can't fit every population. The response is that no single scheme will capture the full dynamic spread of seizures. This is a practical, clinical tool, not a final map of mechanisms. Conclusion, what I'm taking away. 1. The definition of epilepsy expanded. It still includes 2 unprovoked seizures, but can also include 1 unprovoked seizure when the 10-year recurrence risk is greater than or equal to 60%, or a clear epilepsy syndrome after a first event. 2. Epilepsy can be considered resolved after 10 years seizure-free with the last 5 off meds, or after aging out of an age-limited syndrome, acknowledging that low risk isn't zero risk, so we don't use the word cure. 3. Seizure classification keeps a familiar backbone, focal, generalized, unknown, with updated, clearer labels, e.g. focal aware and focal impaired awareness, plus added subtypes in the expanded version. 4. Epilepsy classification runs on 3 levels: seizure type, epilepsy type, syndrome, with etiology and comorbidities alongside, emphasizing the growing roles of genetics and autoimmunity. 5. Using the shared language improves communication, guides treatment, and supports research until a future classification can fully reflect the underlying science of epilepsy networks. And that's it, everyone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in next week's video.